Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 116, and this is for our class for Wednesday, the 19th of February, where we are moving past our first film and starting to talk about some of the short stories in the fiction section. And if you'll remember last class, I had talked a little bit about some techniques for reading carefully, techniques that actually you could utilize with film as well, thinking about the author of the piece and how that might influence the piece, thinking about the date in which the piece was published or the date in which the piece was written, thinking about the title, because titles can be very important in terms of preparing the reader or the viewer for what will be following. The plot, of course, is important because without the plot, you wouldn't necessarily be able to talk about any of the other pieces, which is why the first reading or the first viewing is usually devoted just to understanding plot. The characters, who are they? How do they change over the course of the story? And more importantly, why? The setting. And why is a particular story set in a particular place or places, and how would that story be different if it were set in another place? The use of language, the diction, thinking about the themes or the major issues that are addressed in a particular piece. The ending, endings can be very important. Quotes, and what quotes can you identify that are important in the film or important in the short story? And that's one of the things you'll be doing when you are writing a paper, either about Citizen Kane or one of the short stories, is that you will be using quotation from the text in order to be able to support your argument. The textbook will oftentimes include questions at the ending of some of the short stories. And as you know, you can use any edition of the textbook, and I am providing links for the short stories so that you can find them online for free if you so needed to. But if you are using one of the textbooks, you'll see that there are oftentimes questions at the ending of the stories that will help inform or guide you. And of course, your own questions, which you should write down immediately as they occur to you, because chances are that if you don't, you'll forget them. And then we were talking about literature in the broadest sense of the word, I suppose, as anything that's written, though, of course, we've been treating film as a kind of literary text as well. And the distinction between something that is formulaic, or the textbook calls popular, as opposed to something which is more literary or academic. And the textbook will give us two examples to illustrate the distinction between the two. The first is actually a chapter from a romance novel, and it's entitled A Secret Sorrow. And one of the things that the textbook talks about is how formula fiction has to follow a formula. It has to follow certain criteria, which is why it usually doesn't have the depth or the sophistication that you would find in a literary text. Not that there's anything wrong with formula fiction. Usually it is genre fiction, so it follows a particular category. And there are set rules about how to go about to write that particular formula. As you know, I'm a fan of horror, and horror is one genre. But there are also westerns, there are also romance novels. The textbook happened to focus on a romance novel. This is in no way to disparage romance novels. We could have focused on any of a number of genres. But A Secret Sorrow illustrates how trite and predictable and cliche and simplistic this kind of writing is. I kind of call it comfort food, in the sense that if you've had a long day and you're looking for escapism or you're looking for entertainment, then this is exactly what you want. Something that you don't have to put too much thought or effort into. And you know the ending, and there's something quite satisfying about that. But it's probably not something that we would spend a lot of time talking about in an academic setting. And for the text, A Secret Sorrow, giving you an idea of how formulaic it is, the textbook goes through the criteria that a romance novel author has to follow in terms of who the characters are, what the setting is, what the language is like, how many words are used. And this actually makes me very sad as a teacher, because I oftentimes think about when students ask, how long should my paper be? And I know what the question is. The question is, how much time and effort should I put into it? But I'm really not being sarcastic when I say something to the effect of that your paper should be as long as it needs to be for you to support your thesis or your position. That said, I've given you a suggestion of 4 to 5 pages, so that gives you an idea how much effort to put into the paper. The problem is that oftentimes people will translate that into 4 or 5 pages of words and just use words unnecessarily in order to fill up a page, and that's not what teachers are talking about. They're talking about 4 to 5 pages, let's say, of ideas. But can you imagine telling an artist like Rembrandt how many colors they should use in their canvas, or again, how many words, what length the novel should be, which is what happens with a romance novel. So everything is very detailed. And they give you an example with the text to Secret Sorrows, starting with chapter 11. And we're given a very brief summary of what happens in the first 10 chapters. That also is an alarm bell. If you can easily summarize 10 chapters so that all of us can jump into chapter 11 without having read the book, and I personally have never read the book, and I can tell you that in my face-to-face classes, I ask students if they've read the book. All the years that I've done this, only one student has said that they've read the actual text. So the fact that we could so easily jump into the story, and the synopsis of the story, A Secret Sorrow, is that you have a couple, Faye and Kai, and Faye has a secret and she wants to end their engagement because of her secret, and ultimately the secret is revealed, and it turns out that she's infertile, and they resolve ultimately that they will adopt, and then they do so and they live happily ever after. This is in no way to suggest or imply that this isn't a serious issue. It's a very serious issue. But the fact that it can be resolved within a couple of paragraphs shows how unrealistic and simplistic and superficial the treatment is of a very serious issue. That is in direct contrast to A Sorrowful Woman. And note that the titles are the same, A Secret Sorrow and A Sorrowful Woman, but they're as different as different can be. And if you look in the notes below, I have included a link for A Secret Sorrow, which is the formulaic piece with Faye and Kai. And I've also included a link for A Sorrowful Woman by Gail Godwin, if it turns out that you do not have access to the textbook. And if we were to go through and think about some of the suggestions that I had given about how to read literature, well, first we would think about the author, Gail Godwin. And the textbook will give us a little bit of biographical information. Certainly, you can look up biographical information if you want. And Gail Godwin is a female author, and she published this text in 1971. And that said, if you know anything about the 1970s, it was known for, among other things, the women's rights movement. And I would say that that's going to be particularly important after we read this text to see how Gail Godwin is talking about issues specific to female during this particular time period when life was quite different for female in 1971. There was a lot less opportunity and there was a lot less access. And thinking about titles, notice that it's A Sorrowful Woman, not The Sorrowful Woman. And something as tiny as an article like A or The can make a huge difference because A suggests one of many. The suggests a specific one. So A Sorrowful Woman is that perhaps there are other women who are also sorrowful. And of course, since woman is in the title, I'm making an assumption. I'm going to need to read the text to verify that it's going to be that the theme or the idea of womanhood is going to be important in the piece. And of course, sorrow leads to the question of why is this character sorrowful? And then if we were to look at things like the setting, notice it begins in the winter evening. And that is a very deliberate choice by the author. The author could have said it in the spring, it could have said it in the morning. There are usually certain associations with time periods. So the morning is usually viewed as renewal, rebirth, the beginning of life. And then the afternoon is usually viewed as the height of life, adulthood. And then evening is viewed as the beginning of the descent of life, or middle aged. And then finally, nighttime, which would be considered the ending of life or the elderly. And the same thing happens in terms of seasons, so that the spring is oftentimes associated with renewal, rebirth, summer with the height of life, fall with the beginning of descent, and then finally winter, descent. And the author was well aware of this. We read her bio and we see that she has a PhD in English. We read her bio if we've got the textbook, of course, and that she's won multiple literary awards. So she's quite aware of all of these literary symbols. And she might be using them in the way that we expect, or she might also be usurping our expectations and use them in different ways. But at this point, winter evening suggests negativity. Notice that in A Sorrowful Woman, none of the characters are given names. That's going to be important as well. That they're referred to as the woman or the wife and the child. In other words, these characters represent roles. And that's one of the critiques that happen in this particular story, is that this woman is not seen as an individual. She's seen merely as fulfilling her role as wife and mother. And what opportunities are there for female, or what lack of opportunities are there for female in the 1960s and early 1970s, in terms of being able to express individuality and being able to explore outside of the stereotypical roles associated with female? Those are really the questions of this particular text. And throughout, we get repetition, and oftentimes that is something that's very important. For instance, the color gray is repeated over and over again. The child's eyes are gray, the husband's shirt is gray. At the ending of the story, we're told that she knits gray sweaters. And gray, again, has lots of associations. If you think about a gray day, for instance, oftentimes it's a negative association with sadness or sorrow. That said, gray can also represent ambiguity. It's not the extreme of black or white, it's someplace in between. And there is a good amount of ambiguity in this story, in that, yes, we're supposed to be supportive of the female character because we're getting this from her, from her experience, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't empathize with the husband or the child. And I've always said it would be very interesting to read a short story entitled A Sorrowful Man and get it from his perspective, or A Sorrowful Child and get it from the child's perspective. Images that seem to be seemingly insignificant can be very significant. For instance, there's reference to a bra. And at one point, the husband is helping to undress the wife. Now, the bra is known for being restrictive, and this whole story is about the restrictions that female has in the 60s and early 70s. So that would work very nicely. In fact, you could devote an entire paper just to the significance of the bra if you really wanted to. Bras offer support, and certainly this woman is looking for support. Bras are oftentimes associated with the sensual and the sexual. And if this were a romance novel, when the husband is removing the bra, this would be the beginning of an erotic episode. But that's not what's going to be happening here. And she continually talks about wanting instant sleep. Now, this is a bit of foreshadowing. It's a hint of what's going to be occurring later on in the story. But we may not necessarily recognize it because we haven't read the story yet. So once we get to the ending of the story, then if we were to begin again, and I recommend multiple readings, then you could get the idea of how instant sleep foreshadows the ending, where ultimately she commits suicide. And I know that might be somewhat surprising to some of you if you weren't reading carefully. And that's the thing with literature, is that you need to read carefully. We're never explicitly told at the end that the woman commits suicide. What we're told is that the husband goes into the woman's room. The child says, and this is from the last paragraph, "Look, mommy is sleeping." But as the expression is, out of the mouths of babes oftentimes comes great wisdom, because what he says afterwards is really the crux of this story. She's tired from doing all our things again. So this child, as young as he is, has a certain level of understanding that the father doesn't, even though the father continually says, I understand, I understand. But he doesn't truly understand. And in his defense, perhaps he can't, because the woman isn't able to articulate it. But nevertheless, he dawdled in a stream of the last sun for that day and watched his father roll tenderly back her eyelids. In other words, he's looking for pupil dilation. Lay his ear softly to her breast. In other words, he's listening for a heartbeat. Test the delicate bones of her wrist. In other words, he's looking for a pulse. The father put down his face into her freshly washed hair. In other words, he's mourning. And the boy, again oblivious, says, can we eat the turkey for supper? Because at the very ending, before she commits suicide, she engages in a flurry of activity, illustrating it's not that she's incapable of fulfilling the roles of wife and mother. She's able to cook and clean and sew and everything else. It doesn't bring her satisfaction. And of course, you might say that she has a responsibility to her family, particularly her child, if she's created that child, to not necessarily expect satisfaction. She has responsibility. And certainly I can understand that perspective. That's not necessarily what the author wanted us to focus on, however, or else we would have gotten a very different kind of story. Note that this story begins with a very important quote in italics. And again, you might be tempted to just begin reading with the first sentence, one winter evening, but you should look at everything, starting with the name of the author. And in the textbook, we're given B 1937. B is for born. So this author was born in 1937. And then the title, which we talked about, A Sorrowful Woman, and the date, 1971. And the line we're given in italics is, once upon a time, there was a wife and mother one too many times, which is actually going to be today's attendance question. It's having you try to figure out what that line means. And when you initially read that line, well, you're not going to understand what that line means because you haven't read the story. And then when you're done with the story, then perhaps you can understand that line, or you might have to reread the story so that you can understand the significance of that line. And then as we continue on, we're told that the husband, in an attempt to help her, is making her a sleeping draught. He's making batches of it that'll last a week at a time. This is also some foreshadowing, because this is how she commits suicide. We're told later on in the story that she went to the cupboard and she took what was hers. And in the cupboard is where she's storing these batches of sleeping draughts. So ultimately, this is how she decides to have sleep, or instant sleep, shall we say, that'll last forever. The child, there are episodes where he tries to play with his mother. He pretends to be a vicious tiger. And again, he could have pretended to have been a rabbit, and we might be trying to articulate how and why a rabbit might be significant in the story. But we don't get a rabbit, we get a tiger. And a tiger is a predator. And that's how she basically views her child. After all, we're told in the very first line that the sight of her husband and son made her so sad and sick, she did not want to see them again. And the idea that at one point this vicious tiger, her son playing, scratches her wrist, also some more foreshadowing, because the slashing of the wrist or scratching of the wrist can oftentimes be associated with a common method of suicide. And at one point she hits the child, and she says she did it when the husband would see. In other words, this is her cry for help, but she doesn't know how to articulate help, because that's also something that was true of the late 60s and early 70s, that psychology was not as advanced as it is today, and certainly there was a lot less understanding. It's fairly easy to say that there's mental illness here, but that's not what's interesting about this story. What's interesting is why there is mental illness, which has a lot to do with the roles of wife and mother and what that would mean during that time period. The husband, again, in an attempt to help, a pop psychology term might be enable, hires the perfect girl to assist the woman with her tasks. And she's perfect in part because she's not pretty. So she can't be a romantic rival. But the girl ends up being a rival because the girl is able to fulfill all of the roles that the wife and mother cannot, and do so happily. Now, granted, the girl is compensated for doing so. She's hired for doing so, and she can be fired or decide to leave of her own free will, which is different than a wife and mother, which is embedded in this idea within the story. And eventually, the woman, feeling so threatened, fires the girl. Notice that the girl moves into a white room. Lots of associations with white, some positive. Purity, new start, some negative. It's very institutional, for instance, very bland. Um, and then the woman moves into the room, and it says that she basically wants to be like the girl. And the woman is wearing an old sweater from school. The idea that she's trying to relive a past when she didn't necessarily have the responsibilities of being a wife and a mother. We're told it's the winter afternoon. Now, we know the story started in the winter, and we know that winter oftentimes has negative associations. But we began in the evening and we go to the afternoon. So, from my thinking as a reader, this is an improvement in terms of the woman's situation because the afternoon usually has more positive associations. So I'm thinking that while it might not necessarily be positive that the woman isolates herself from her family, it might be positive for the woman, especially because she's doing things like looking outside of a window. Um, she's brushing her hair, which is a kind of self care, something that she might not necessarily have had a chance to do when she was taking care of the child. Um, there also are lots of fairy tale assumptions in this piece. Think about the first story we talked about, A Sorrowful Woman, which is very much like a fairy tale, and that they adopt and live happily ever after. And this story, or I'm sorry, A Secret Sorrow, the first story that we read, is very much kind of like a fairy tale where Faye and Kai adopt and then they live happily ever after. A Sorrowful Woman is much more complex. It talks about what happens with the ever after, and sometimes it's not happy. Even if seemingly you would have everything. Obviously, this family has a certain level of financial comfort. They go out, they hire a girl, they get their laundry taken out. If you were looking at the details, she's waiting for the laundry to come back in. We don't get any reference to there being any kind of health issues or domestic abuse, nothing of that nature. So the idea is what happens when you have the seemingly perfect life, but yet you still aren't satisfied with that life. And again, you could say that that's very selfish not to be satisfied with that life. But the reality is that most people want to improve their situation regardless of what their situation is. So, fairy tales also suggest Rapunzel, who brushed and basically let down her hair. So that's another association that you could make with the hair brushing. Female oftentimes is judged by appearance, and that oftentimes means hair. That's another association you can make. And the woman is spending time writing sonnets. Now, in some ways, this might be a bit unfair, at least for us as reader, because at this point in the semester, we have not talked about poetry. We will be talking about poetry eventually, and we will study the sonnet. So you may or may not know that a sonnet is a very strictly regulated form of poetic writing, that it has a certain structure, it has a certain length, it has a certain rhyme scheme, which means a certain pattern of how the words rhyme at the ending of each of the poem's lines. And the way that you determine rhyme to see if there is a pattern is you use letters of the alphabet. So A is supposed to represent our initial rhyme, and any word that rhymes with the A that ends the line is basically an A rhyme. And then when we begin a new rhyme, that would be a B rhyme, and we do the same throughout the entire poem so that we can come up with the pattern. And at one point, she's contemplating her sonnet and thinking about ABBA. And ABBA is not ABBA, the rock group from the 70s. ABBA is the rhyme pattern that she is contemplating for the sonnet, because the sonnet is supposed to have a certain pattern of rhyme, as we will talk about. It's supposed to have a certain length. It's supposed to have a certain number of syllables. It's supposed to be addressing certain topics. So, in other words, her first go-to is to write a sonnet that has a lot of rules. This makes sense thematically with the story because Wife and Mother has a lot of rules as well. So when she contemplates that, she can write any kind of poem. It doesn't have to be a sonnet. It doesn't even have to rhyme. It's a wonderful analogy for what's happening within the story itself. That she doesn't necessarily have to follow the rules of Wife and Mother, nor does she have to follow the rules of writing a sonnet, which is what she's experimenting with when she isolates herself from the family. And I know this might seem somewhat unrealistic that she isolates herself to the point where she's only accepting notes under the door. But I can't help but think of Emily Dickinson, whom we will discuss as the semester progresses when we get to the poetry section, who very much isolated herself. So it really is not that different. Emily Dickinson was a real person, however, and the woman in A Sorrowful Woman is, of course, fictional. And I can't help but think about our current day when people text one another, even if they're sitting next to each other. So perhaps that's comparable to putting a note under the door in some respects. At any rate, the story moves to spring. And again, if I'm moving from the winter to the spring, and I'm moving from times of day, the evening to the morning, which is what happens at the ending, I'm thinking that this is going to be positive, at least for the major female character. It may not necessarily be positive for the family, but certainly since this female has been struggling with the idea of achieving a certain level of autonomy and independence, it seems like she's on the road to do that. And that is completely upset by the idea that she went to the cupboard and took what was hers, completes all of those chores. In other words, she fulfills her expectations, and then ultimately commits suicide. And the message of the story is not supposed to be that the only way out of repressive roles is through death. We're supposed to be upset at this ending and perhaps demand societal change. And society has indeed changed since then, perhaps in part because of pieces of literature such as this one. And you don't necessarily have to agree with the author's perspective, but you do need to be able to identify the author's perspective before you're able to decide whether you agree or disagree. Notice how little interaction the woman has with the outside world. It's all about being in the home, and it's all about the nuclear family. And some of the questions at the ending of the story, which are in our textbook, will give you an idea of some of the reasons why these two pieces, A Secret Sorrow and A Sorrowful Woman, were paired with one another. So, for instance, asking, how do the two women's attitudes in the two stories toward family life differ? And obviously, there's a big difference. Or how is the woman's problem in A Sorrowful Woman made more complex than Faye's problem in A Secret Sorrow? And to what extent might A Sorrowful Woman be regarded as an unromantic sequel to A Secret Sorrow? Or perhaps my favorite question is question 7 in my edition of the text. Can both stories be read a second or third time and still be interesting? That really is my definition of something that is worth to be included in the canon. Those works that are considered by scholars and critics to be worthy of academic study because they have a certain level of depth and complexity to them and talk about timeless and universal themes in the human condition, that I think we could read A Sorrowful Woman multiple times. I certainly have, and find new details and new evidence to examine and discuss. But once you've read the first piece, The Secret Sorrow, there really isn't any reason to read it again. Now, certainly there have been sociologists and psychologists who've studied things like romance novels to try to talk about the role of female in society, and that is one academic way you could do that. You can apply academic principles to anything. You can analyze television commercials if you so wanted to. And in fact, I've had my own students do that in some of my classes. But the reality is that A Sorrowful Woman is much more complex than A Secret Sorrow is. Probably you could read A Secret Sorrow very quickly. You wouldn't need to take notes and you understood everything. A Sorrowful Woman, right from the very beginning, when we're given that line, once upon a time, There was a wife and mother one too many times. And in fact, one of the questions in my edition of the text, 11, says that this is known as an epigraph, when you've got an opening line that basically sets the stage for the story that's going to be following. Or thinking about critical strategies, as we began the semester with, and we were talking about ways to analyze a text. There are lots of different lenses that you can use to focus on particular elements, whether or not you wanted to focus on the author's biography, though that can be tricky because sometimes an author is merely creating fiction, so their biography isn't necessarily that connected to the piece that they are creating. Or whether or not you wanted to focus on history, the time period of the piece. So I was suggesting, knowing that this piece was written in 1971 during the women's movement. And by the way, a little factoid, during the women's movement in the 1970s, women oftentimes burned bras in protest. So that's another way of examining the bra element in this story, which is mentioned just briefly, but notice that something that's just mentioned briefly can be examined in a quite detailed way. The child isn't just a vicious tiger, but he acts like a grasshopper. And again, the idea that something that's alien, an insect, and the fact that the woman fears the child, and or at least doesn't see the child as a tender golden three, which is how the child is described at the beginning. And the idea of perfection with a child, a tender golden three, unless you spend time with the 3-year-old, and you'll know that the stereotype of perfection that Faye and Kai were chasing isn't necessarily the truth. Even the description of the husband, he's called receptive, gentle, but the first word that's used to describe him is durable. It's a very odd word to use to describe a significant other. I can't help but think of the tires on my car, for instance, being durable. So, as I had indicated, today's attendance question is going to be on the opening line of this piece. Why do you think A Sorrowful Woman begins with the opening phrase, "Once upon a time, there was a wife and mother, one too many times"? As you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but I certainly encourage you to respond to your classmates. But you are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. That'll give you a good idea of the class discussion we would have had about this particular story. And your discussion forum question is due Friday on the 21st. But certainly, if you need additional time, please let me know. And I'll be happy to grant you an extension. So where we are now is thinking about some of the short stories that follow. Again, if you'll see in the notes below, I've given you some links of some of the short stories that are coming up. The Story of an Hour, which was included in an earlier set of readings that I had assigned in our textbook about how to read literature. But I wanted us to revisit this story, and I provided you a link where you can find it online, to analyze it in the way that we just analyzed A Sorrowful Woman. And what you will find with The Story of an Hour is that it was written decades earlier, but it examines many similar themes. So it seems that in some ways it would have influenced Gail Godwin when she was talking about A Sorrowful Woman. I can't help but liken it to musicians, that you can appreciate a singer or a musician's song as an independent unit. But once you learn a little bit more about how that musician was influenced by previous musicians, you have a much richer understanding of their music. And it's the same with literature. Now, I know we're just beginning our journey with literature, so you may not necessarily have done enough reading of literature to see how one piece influences another. But it's pretty clear when you read The Story of an Hour that that has inspired A Sorrowful Woman. So with a more modern twist, but as much as things change, they oftentimes remain the same. I also have given a story by William Faulkner, Rose for Emily, and I've included a link for that. One of the things that I find fascinating about this particular story is that it includes a author interview. And that's in the textbook. Unfortunately, I've been unable to find the link, but I will read you some of the interview responses in our next class so that we can talk about the author's perspective and could that perhaps be different from our perspective as a reader. And Yes, it could be. That was the point that I was trying to make with that, but we'll talk about that later. So I hope that at this point you're at least contemplating what you might want to write your first paper on. Some of you might already know that you're writing on Citizen Kane, so you can begin, though I'll be talking about the elements of how to write a paper over the next couple classes as a kind of review. This is also included in the textbook as well, but I'll also be uploading a handout for you. Or you might be deciding that you are going to write about, let's say, something like A Sorrowful Woman. And since we're fairly close to putting closure onto that story, perhaps you can begin that. I suggest you wait until we've talked about it in its entirety before you actually put a lot of work into it. And certainly that if you're going to talk about one of the upcoming stories, which are possibilities for your paper, that it probably makes sense to wait a bit until we've had some conversation about it, because that'll probably help inform your writing. And as you know, that paper is due midway through the semester, because by that point we would have finished everything in the unit for fiction. But you can hand it in early, and I encourage you to hand it in early. I have what I call rolling deadlines. But certainly by the midpoint of the semester is when you would want to hand in a formal paper so that you could have a grade, or if not, then certainly have a conversation with me about what's going on. So, with that said, I'll leave you with your attendance question as to why you think A Sorrowful Woman begins with the opening phrase, "Once upon a time, there was a wife and mother, one too many times." I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.